Additional items and evidence from Cathy's case were submitted to the Arizona DPS Crime Lab for updated DNA testing in late 2017. These were the bike helmet, swabs from both rocks, a swab from the ratchet wrench, and Cathy's fingernail clippings. The lab's report, dated January 25, 2018, says they weren't able to make any more headway on the helmet or the ratchet, on which a partial male DNA profile had been found a few years earlier. Basically, insufficient DNA remained on these items for the state crime lab to extract. The same was true for the rocks. From the fingernails, the lab was able to obtain a very small amount of Y DNA in the form of a mixture with Cathy's DNA. Again, this partial male profile was a mixture and was not conducive to entry into CODIS. However, there were sufficient markers for entry into the Arizona State DNA database, referred to as SDIS. No hits were generated there. And everyone the investigators tested against the fingernail Y DNA profile going forward failed to match. What this meant was that even in the late 2010s, the Cathy Sposito homicide was not in the national DNA database known as CODIS due to insufficient DNA. Cathy's case could only be solved through direct comparison testing. Okay, we're going to take a little detour here and discuss a suspect who hovered in the background of this case for years. This was Edward Gum. Gum was an Arizona sexual predator who preyed on women and girls he encountered in outdoor settings. He was arrested in May 1982 at age 25 for attempting to sexually assault a woman he abducted at knife point from a Midtown Tucson neighborhood. He forced her into a car, drove to a remote area, and sexually assaulted her by demanding her to perform fellatio. He then slashed her with a knife and pushed her out of the car after she bit him, according to the Tucson Citizen. The survivor got the license plate number, and Gum was arrested and sentenced to prison. He was released in September of 1986. In 1981, he sexually assaulted 2 girls on the Granite Dells hiking trail. According to the report, quote, on September 14, 1991, 2 young women were sexually assaulted at gunpoint. The ordeal lasted almost an hour, during which time the victims were forced to perform various sexual acts with the assailant and with each other. The victims reported these crimes to police immediately, end quote. Sexual assault kits were collected, but that case was not immediately solved. But in 1992, Gum attempted to sexually assault a girl at Granite Creek Park. He was arrested and given a 15-year sentence. He was due to be released in 2004. But in 2002, pursuant to state law, he was required to give blood to enter a DNA sample into CODIS. When he did, a DNA hit linked Gum to the unsolved 1991 Granite Dells double sexual assault case. For that one, he got a 56-year sentence. He is never getting out. Gum was interviewed by YCSO Detective Bentley in 2004 about Cathy Sposito's case, but he denied any involvement. He also denied owning any guns, which was a lie, as a gun had been used in the Granite Dells assault. Then, in 2012, the police got a tip on the Cathy Sposito tip line from somebody nicknamed Rattlesnake Dan, whose real name was Dalton H., that Ed Gum was responsible for the Cathy Sposito murder. Detective Diskin interviewed Dalton on February 9, 2012. The story was that Dalton's girlfriend at the time, Colleen, was friends with Ed Gum's wife, Karen. One day, shortly after Cathy's murder, Gum and Karen came over to Dalton's house. When the 2 women left the room, Gum, who had been drinking, started crying and told Dalton he'd killed that girl on Thumb Butte. He said he used rocks to bludgeon her. He implied that he killed her because he wanted to have sex with her, but she rejected him. The YCSO investigators did a lot of work following up on this promising-sounding Ed Gum lead. They confirmed that Gum was indeed living in Prescott Valley in the 1980s, and that he was an avid hiker. His brother Neil worked at a bar right near Prescott College. Gum's now ex-wife Karen stated that Gum hiked almost every day. He regularly hiked Thumb Butte while they lived in Prescott Valley, and he always carried a knife. Detective Lopez interviewed Dalton H. again in June 2018. Quote, Dalton said that Gum told him that he was going to sexually assault the girl, but things got out of hand, and he ended up hitting her on the head with a rock. Gum told Dalton that he was covered in blood, so he had to stay off the main roads and walked home to Prescott Valley from Thumb Butte. Gum confessed to Dalton that he discarded his blood-soaked shirt somewhere on Glassford Hill while he was walking, end quote. Dalton agreed to take a polygraph exam to verify the information he was reporting about Ed Gum. Special Agent Pierce from the FBI administered the polygraph. After the exam, Agent Pierce said that Dalton passed the polygraph with no issues and was believed to be telling the truth. The questions that were asked during the polygraph were if Ed Gum confessed to him that he killed Cathy Sposito on Thumb Butte, and if Ed Gum confessed this when he was at Dalton's house. So it was clear that Dalton believed that Gum had killed Cathy, and Gum had told him as much, or so he thought. Further, Dalton stated that he'd reported this confession to the YCSO way back in 1987 when Cathy was killed, but no one had ever followed up. So he called in the tip again in 2012 when he learned about the reward money. On June 12, 2018, Detective Lopez and Sergeant Pritchard visited Ed Gum at the Arizona State Prison and asked him about Cathy's case. Sergeant Pritchard had interviewed Gum in 2017, so he remembered the detective, now Sergeant. They read him his Miranda rights, and Gum said the first time he heard of Cathy's case was in 2017 when they talked to him about it. He admitted that he was an avid hiker and sometimes would hike for 2 to 3 days, walking all the way from Prescott Valley to Prescott. Hiking was a good way for him to unwind, he said. Although he claimed he didn't go to Thumb Butte very often, he then said he would park his car near the Thumb Butte scenic overlook and walk in from the backside of Thumb Butte to the trail. Sometimes he would even walk off the trail. He would make his own trail and hike around for a few hours. He said he would go up there while he waited for Karen to get off work at the hospital, and her shifts varied. She worked both days and nights. So basically, they got a confession from him that he was loitering around Thumb Butte at all hours, tromping through the woods off the trail. He was then asked why he was downplaying the amount of time he spent at Thumb Butte, and he admitted that it was a place of opportunistic attacks for him. He went on to say that sometimes his attacks on women were simply ones of convenience. His path would cross with a woman, and he thought, let's do this. Gum admitted that he had great recollection of every sexual assault he'd committed, and that he continued to fantasize about them. When they asked Gum about guns that he owned, he admitted that he owned a Marlin .22 caliber rifle. In his 2004 and 2017 interviews, he had denied having any guns. I enjoyed this quote from the report. Sergeant Pritchard then told Gum that the ballistics from the crime scene showed that 2 possible guns used were a Marlin .22 and a Jennings J22, which his sister owned before hers was stolen. Gum stated that he didn't know that his sister had a Jennings and that he wouldn't steal from his family. Sergeant Pritchard then reminded him that he had just told us that he had stolen a gun from his brother. Gum replied, "I guess," end quote. Whoops. When they told Gum that Dalton had tipped them that he was involved in Cathy's murder, his overall demeanor changed and he became very agitated and aggressive. But he flat out denied being a killer. As the detectives pointed out, he had denied all his other rapes as well. They told him Cathy's didn't appear to be a planned murder. Perhaps he didn't intend to kill her, but instead it was something that got out of hand because Cathy fought back and wouldn't comply with his demands. Sergeant Pritchard then informed Gum that they were unable to exclude him based on the DNA. In short, they only had a partial DNA sample to compare suspects' profiles to, and Ed Gum's shared some of the same genetic markers. From Sergeant Pritchard's report, quote, I asked Gum why it's a possibility that his DNA was found at the scene. He replied, I have no idea. I could have been in that area in part of Thumb Butte. I did go up there a few times. I don't know what kind of stuff you're testing on her or what. I have no effing idea. But I know that I did not kill no girl, end quote. They continued to push him. This from Detective Lopez's report. Quote, Gum then said, you got to play that denial factor for a little while. And he laughed and said, I guess we'll just have to wait and see if the DNA really pans out, if it really is mine. Then I don't know what the hell to say. And I can't think how my DNA would get on her backpack. When Gum said this about Cathy's backpack, it struck Sergeant Pritchard and I as odd, and was a detail that he would not know. At no time did we speak about DNA on Cathy's backpack, nor did we speak at all about the backpack she was wearing. It has been a theory in this case that the suspect grabbed Cathy by the backpack as she was running away and used this as a handle to gain control, end quote. When Sergeant Pritchard recapped all the circumstantial evidence they had on Gum, he offered to take a polygraph. They had fortuitously brought with them Special Agent Pierce from the FBI, who was all set up and ready with his equipment. After the exam, Agent Pierce notified Sergeant Pritchard that Ed Gum had failed the polygraph when asked if he'd killed Cathy. This is in the report, though. In the polygraph, Gum admitted to Agent Pierce about 10 other sexual assaults or attempts that he committed in the Prescott area between 1986 and 1987, 3 of which were in the Thumb Butte area, end quote. But he continued to deny killing Cathy. After the polygraph concluded, Gum told them he wasn't interested in speaking about Cathy's murder anymore. Either they arrest him or leave him alone. Then Sergeant Pritchard asked him about the 1990 assault on Sarah. Gum said he didn't do that one either, and that everything he did he had admitted to the polygrapher. Quote, I told Gum that Prescott in the late 80s was pretty small and had a tough time believing that there was more than one guy running around committing crimes like this, end quote. But Sergeant Pritchard was wrong. There was more than one guy running around Prescott in the late 80s violently raping women. The Y-DNA from the fingernail clippings in Cathy's case was used to eliminate quite a few people who were the subject of VICAP alerts to the Yavapai investigators, because their MOs were not dissimilar. These included Joseph Zylstra. In 1993, Zylstra had sexually assaulted 2 Prescott girls who were out hiking Granite Dells. An October 2018 DPS lab report excluded Zylstra as a contributor to the Y-DNA under Cathy's nails. In December 2019, Richard Bible, who murdered 9-year-old Jennifer Wilson in 1998, was excluded the same way. Investigators continued to run into brick wall after brick wall. In June 2019, the sheriff's office again issued a public plea for information about the case, which was now 32 years old. They reminded the public of the availability of a $10,000 reward for information. They said they were using new DNA technologies to help them solve the case. But any hopes they might have had of scaring the actual killer to come forward didn't work, for reasons that will become clear. The same plea for information was issued in 2020 by the sheriff, Scott Masher, who had worked the case as a deputy. Then, in June 2021, new sheriff David Rhodes said in a statement, quote, 34 years is a long time, and many people have moved on with their lives, but our detectives and cold case investigators haven't forgotten what happened to Cathy, and they are actively working this case. We know someone has information about what happened to Cathy. We just hope they do the right thing and come forward. End quote. On June 9, 2020, Yavapai Detective Deron Franklin contacted FBI Special Agent Krause of the Phoenix Field Office about the possibility of using forensic genealogy in Cathy's case. Agent Krause arranged for Gene by Gene in Houston, Texas, to perform a DNA extraction from evidence to prepare a SNP profile. The Yavapai authorities submitted their best remaining evidence, half of an oral swab from Cathy's mouth, known to contain a mixed sample of the DNA of an unknown male and Cathy's DNA. They also provided a vial of Cathy's blood for a standard to differentiate. In short, it didn't work. There just wasn't enough intact DNA to work with, and no SNP profile could be generated from the material provided. Although forensic genealogy cases were being solved right and left at this point, Cathy's case did not qualify. It was a shocking disappointment. 2022 was the 35th anniversary of Cathy Sposito's murder. Sal Sposito, her brother, had done an interview with NBC 12 saying, "We never want to give up hope." Sal said when he learned of his sister's murder, it was shocking, something nobody wants to go through. This was no accident. Somebody with a lot of rage and anger wanted to put an end to her life. Sal and Cathy's father died in 2010, and their mother passed away a few years later. I always said she died of a broken heart because the last 27 years of her life, she took it the worst, Sal said to NBC 12. Investigators had done what they could do in Cathy's case. They were going to have to look elsewhere for resolution. Let's backtrack a little to the 1990s sexual assault survivor Sarah's case. In 2017, the YCSO launched a reinvestigation of this case. A report by Sergeant Pritchard notes that the physical evidence sent to the DPS crime lab back in 1990 had been destroyed. I know, it's unbearable. But all was not lost. The DPS had retained some of the samples collected from Sarah's clothing and her rape kit in the freezer at its Flagstaff lab. From the report, quote, "At this time, it is unknown what these samples actually are. This case is being reevaluated as it may be similar to other sexual assault cases and a cold case homicide," end quote. Of course, they're talking about Cathy's case. Pritchard interviewed Sarah on July 28, 2017. She must have been absolutely floored when Yavapai County authorities contacted her 27 years after her sexual assault. I imagine her feelings at dredging up that terrifying and scarring incident, yet wanting someone to care about her unsolved case. Pritchard called her up and told her he was reinvestigating her case and whether it was connected to Cathy's murder on the same trail 3 years earlier. He said he wanted to get a DNA sample from Sarah and her boyfriend at the time. DPS had agreed to test the samples they still had in evidence from her rape kit and on her clothing, but they needed a sample from her and her boyfriend as elimination samples. What were the chances she was still in touch with him, some dude she was camping with 27 years earlier? Well, they were good. She had married him, and they were still married. She told Detective Pritchard to come on over. Sarah and her husband said they weren't really interviewed a whole lot back in 1990. The husband had been barely talked to. He was never asked if he saw any other people or cars in the area, for example. They weren't even asked the names of other campers they were with, or if they were, the police files were lost. Sarah was never taken to the trail to find the spot where her attack occurred. Sergeant Pritchard reviewed her original statement with her, and she remembered it all, and was able to add that she believed the tattoo on her assailant's bicep was some kind of bird. Then Sergeant Pritchard asked her if she still believed the suspect never ejaculated during the attack, and she said yes. But then he pointed out that in her original statement, she said her boyfriend wore a condom when they had sex the night before. At this point, the husband perked up and said, "I did?" And she said, "Yes, I remember that." Pritchard's report reads, quote, "I explained that my hope was to solve who did this to Sarah with DNA. I explained that the manner in which this occurred, being brazen and on the popular trail, was possibly not the first or last sexual assault committed by the suspect. I further added because Sarah doesn't recall seeing anybody on the trail, the assailant may have been lying in wait or hiding like a predator. Because of the sexual motivation, the possibility exists that he may have masturbated in the forest or had semen on him already, which could have been transferred to her during the commission of this crime." End quote. At the end of the interview, Sergeant Pritchard took buccal swabs from Sarah and her husband and told them it might be quite a while before they knew anything as a result of the DNA analysis. It must have seemed very unlikely to the couple that anything would come of these quick cheek swabs decades after the event. But something did come of it, as we'll hear. Sergeant Pritchard next contacted one of the other men who had been camping with Sarah and her boyfriend and another couple that day. I'll call him Don. Don worked for Motorola at the time and recalled that the third camping couple was his co-worker and his wife, and their kids were with them too. They camped 3/4 of a mile down Thumb Butte Road from the campground at the trailhead. But Don remembered some disturbing things about this camping trip. For one thing, right at midnight, the campers could hear what he described as satanic chanting coming from the forest around them. There were many voices chanting the same sounds, and it was loud enough that the kids in the group were scared. Some even started crying. The adults were concerned enough that they considered bailing on the camping and going to a motel. I vote yes to that plan. Don and the other men searched around the woods but didn't see anyone. The chanting stopped, and they then saw 7 cars' headlights driving east on Thumb Butte Road toward Prescott. After that, it was silence, but something else happened. Around 3 a.m., all the campers were asleep when a vehicle turned from Thumb Butte Road directly toward their campsite. It shined its bright lights on the tents. The men all got out with their guns and stood there, and after about 4 minutes, the vehicle turned around and drove off. Who knows whether these incidents had anything to do with what happened to Sarah just a few hours later, but they are hella creepy, and at least the headlight incident seemed intended to tell the campers to get TF out of there. But they didn't, and Sarah was attacked the next morning. Don remembered that after Sarah was taken to the hospital that morning, the men in the group asked the deputies if they could go out and search the area for the suspect. They were given permission, and while they didn't find him, they did find what appeared to be an older campsite along a creek bed. Rocks were stamped in some kind of igloo formation there, but it didn't appear that anyone had been using it lately. Now, Don actually came to Prescott and met with Detective Pritchard and showed him where their campsite was that night. They also went to the old igloo site, where there was now a lean-to that looked as though it had been there for years. They also found a large clearing, 440 yards from the campsite used by the group. The location of this clearing meshed exactly with what Don related about the direction the creepy chanting had been coming from. Don's ex-wife recalled that at the time, she mentioned the satanic chanting to one of the deputies who spoke with the group after the attack on Sarah, and he told her that those types of ceremonies were known to take place in Prescott. Sergeant Pritchard tracked down the last camper, the other Motorola guy. He didn't remember the chanting or the headlights. But Don's ex-wife verified the whole thing and said she was so freaked out after that weekend she never returned to Prescott. I don't blame her. This is why I don't camp. Sergeant Pritchard went so far as to look in depth into the 3 digits Sarah had related were written on the piece of paper in her attacker's pack of cigarettes. He even had the county assessor's office research a list of addresses in the Prescott area that had those 3 numbers on them, in the off chance that an address with those numbers could be tied to a suspect. But they also could have been part of a phone number or a social security number or a lock combination or many other things, and they did not provide the key to the killer. Pritchard submitted the buccal swabs from Sarah and her husband to the DPS lab. He also submitted the found evidence, 3 cuttings from Sarah's old blue sweatpants, a cutting from her underwear, and a sample of something called vaginal aspirate. Here are the results, per the January 13th, 2018 lab report by DPS lab analyst Aaron Daniel. Quote, the STR and YSTR DNA profile from the sperm fraction of the cuttings from the blue sweatpants is a mixture. An unidentified male DNA profile developed from the major component of the cuttings from the blue sweatpants has been entered into CODIS. And this was the reason Sergeant Pritchard had wanted a DNA sample from Sarah's husband. If he had worn a condom, there should not have been semen all over Sarah's sweatpants. If it was from him, that condom was not doing its job. But it did do its job. The semen on the sweatpants worn by Sarah during her attack was indeed not her husband's. It belonged to someone unknown, who was presumably the man who attacked her on the Thumb Butte Trail 30 years earlier. Sergeant Pritchard called Sarah and asked her basically straight up if there was anybody else the semen could belong to. He's asked her directly if she was seeing anyone besides her now husband. She said no. And while she was sure that the suspect did not penetrate her for sexual intercourse, she wasn't sure if he had possibly ejaculated on her sweatpants. Well, he had. As you heard, DPS entered this new suspect DNA profile into CODIS. There were no hits, but as we know, CODIS is no longer the end-all be-all in cases with unidentified offenders. On March 14, 2018, Detective E. Lopez, who took over the case after Sergeant Pritchard was promoted to lieutenant, spoke with Christina Green at the DPS Crime Lab to discuss their options in Sarah's sexual assault case. Ms. Green suggested that the case was a good candidate for familial DNA testing. It was a good idea, but it took a long time, and in the end, it didn't work. On November 8, 2018, Detective Lopez received results from the DPS lab to the effect that no results were found during the familial DNA search of the Arizona database of convicted offenders and arrestees that had DNA on file. The search was only done out to the first-degree relatives, meaning that the relative would have had to have been a father, son, brother, or some other direct relative, and there were simply none in the database. They soldiered on. Psaki grant money from the Maricopa County DA's office, federal funds designated to help end the backlog in state sexual assault kit testing, was used to send DNA extracts from a cutting of Sarah's blue sweatpants to Parabon Nanolabs. Detective Franklin requested a phenotype analysis, which was completed on April 9, 2020. The phenotype report contained prediction results for the suspect's skin color, eye color, hair color, freckling, face morphology, and genomic ancestry. According to Parabon's report, the suspect was predicted to have fair to very fair skin with 89% confidence, blue or green eyes with 99.2% confidence, brown or blonde hair with 90.6% confidence, and few to some freckles with 80.9% confidence. The subject was 99.93% Northern European, which may indicate ancestry from the British Isles. Okay, so they knew they were looking for a white dude with fair skin. The haystack just got a little smaller, but still no needle. In November 2020, a second report was received from Parabon. It contained the results of their genealogy analysis performed by Parabon genealogist Stephanie Wyatt. The suspect's SNP profile was uploaded to both GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. And while the genealogist found quite a few DNA relatives in the databases, the genealogy process was incredibly complex. The top DNA relative in Family Tree DNA shared 84 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect. But it was clear that he or she, this top DNA relative, was in search of their own unknown birth parent. So the ancestral part of that person's tree was unknown, and they were of limited use to the genealogist. The next highest match had obscured his or her identity, So even though Ms. Wyatt could see the amount of DNA this person shared with the suspect, because she didn't know who he or she was, they were also useless to her in terms of tree building. So she had to move on to the third highest DNA relative, a person who shared just 57 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect. Ms. Wyatt told me that, quote, there were more than 40 matches that shared a relatively large single segment of DNA that resisted recombination for many generations. Despite constructing many trees for these ICW matches, the analyst could not identify a common ancestor among them. The colloquial term for this phenomenon is sticky segment. Once the matches with the sticky segment were removed, the focus of the investigation was identifying a branch that tied in via marriage, end quote. Ms. Wyatt told me that she spent countless hours working this puzzle, trying to identify the correct descendants of William Bennett, born all the way back in 1770. Additional matches in the databases of 54 centimorgans, 49 centimorgans, 41 centimorgans, 20 centimorgans, and 17 centimorgans helped her identify a set of Bennett's descendants who were likely the suspect's grandparents. She got lucky in that one of the branches was the only one with any roots in Yavapai County, where the attacks had taken place, so this branch was the one she focused on. She identified the suspect's maternal line through a surname, Hales, that she could see in this tree. Finally, she was able to narrow it down to two brothers, who still bore the surname of their ancestor from 200 years earlier, Bennett. Their names were C. Bennett and Brian Bennett. Brian Bennett was dead. His younger brother, C., was still alive. Both brothers had lived in Yavapai County during both Cathy and Sarah's attacks. Both had attended Prescott High School. But C. Bennett had been only 14 at the time of Cathy's murder. Brian, who was 16 in 1987, had a criminal record that aligned with what they suspected he had done to Cathy and Sarah, multiple arrests related to sexual assault and or kidnapping. And Brian, it was noted, looked just like the Parabon snapshot phenotype prediction composite profile. While all this was going on, YCSO cold case investigator Rich Finston had been asked to compare the suspect DNA in Cathy's case to the suspect DNA in Sarah's case. Here is an excerpt from his report. Quote, the DPS Flagstaff laboratory provided results of Y DNA extracted from a rectal swab item taken from Sarah's rape kit. The results were compared to 3 pieces of evidence from the victim number 1 homicide, Cathy Sposito. The victim number 1 evidence consisted of one of the murder weapon rocks, an oral swab of the blood in her mouth, and her underwear. The swab and the rock each provided consistent partial Y profiles in 14 of 22 occupied loci. The panties provided a profile of multiple male contributors, occupying all 22 loci, and also consistent with the partials from the rock and oral swab. End quote. The upshot of the report was that, quote, Sarah's sample was consistent in every one of the 22 loci with one or more of the 3 Cathy evidence samples. Thus, we cannot exclude that Sarah and Cathy had a common assailant. Mic drop. It was official. They no longer just suspected a serial assailant. They now had proof that he was real, and he had a name. It was time to get a DNA sample from Brian Scott Bennett's relatives to try to confirm Parabon's identification. Investigators knew that Brian Bennett had a daughter, whom I'm calling A.N. Bennett, living in Kentucky, and his mother, whom I'm calling Marie, also lived in Kentucky. Yavapai authorities contacted the Kentucky State Police for assistance in obtaining DNA samples from the 2 Bluegrass State residents. KSP detectives contacted Marie and obtained a consensual DNA sample, and they were also able to obtain one from A.N. Brian Bennett's brother, C. Bennett, was also contacted, but he refused to provide a sample. In May 2021, a report received from Parabon Nanolabs confirmed that A.N.'s father was the perpetrator of the sexual assault on Sarah. But they needed to make sure the identification was 100% certain. There was the remote possibility that Brian Bennett was not A.N.'s father. In other words, they had confirmation that A.N. was the unknown assailant's child, but they had only A.N.'s word for it that her father was Brian Bennett. They wanted to tighten up the identification. I'm abbreviating this part, but in order to be sure that C. Bennett was not the murderer and rapist, they staked out his house and grabbed his trash. They did some testing on one of the items. There were a bunch of bottles, a styrofoam cup, and a corn cob, and they found only female DNA. Since most of these law enforcement agencies are not made of money, they halted testing and decided to go a different route. It was time to try to get a direct DNA sample from C. Bennett. He had refused their initial request and the trash pull had failed, so this time they obtained a search warrant mandating that he provide buccal swab samples. Then they headed to Kentucky to find him. On September 12, 2022, Detective Sergeant C. Owens, Detective Franklin, and Lieutenant M. Dannison from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, and Sergeant Z. Jones from the Kentucky State Police, as well as some other KSP officers, waited for C. Bennett outside his house. When he drove up in his work truck and parked in his driveway, Sergeant Jones made contact with him. C. Bennett could see the masses of cops waiting to talk to him, so he agreed to get out of the cab and went back to the tailgate section, where he sat while Sergeant Owens and Detective Franklin approached him. Detective Franklin introduced himself and asked C. Bennett if he remembered a couple years ago, when Detective Franklin called him and told him they were looking into an unsolved sexual assault. He had refused to provide a DNA sample. Yes, he remembered. Detective Franklin asked C. Bennett if he wanted to talk about his time in Prescott and his brother. C. Bennett replied that he didn't know too much about that situation. Detective Franklin told C. Bennett that they were able to get DNA evidence in the sexual assault, and it came back to either him or his brother Brian. C. Bennett immediately replied, "I don't know anything about that." He confirmed that he and his brother had lived in Prescott with their family. He was then asked if he and his brother ever talked about being up on Thumb Butte, and he said, "No, I don't even know where Thumb Butte is." Sergeant Owens then told C. Bennett that they had reason to believe his brother, Brian Bennett, was involved in a homicide, and C. Bennett again said he didn't know anything about that. They asked him if he knew something about it if he would tell them, and he said, "Sure, I got nothing to hide." The sergeant then told C. Bennett that they had court papers for his DNA. C. Bennett seemed really to not understand what this meant and asked if this was a court order. When the officers said yes, he asked, "So if I refuse, I go to jail?" And they said basically yes. Then C. Bennett asked again what the second crime they were investigating was, and when they told him it was a murder, he said to go ahead and get the swabs out and do what they were going to do. They took 8 buccal swabs. When they were done, C. Bennett rambled on that he'd done some, quote, crazy shit before, but I never killed anyone and I ain't ever attacked anyone. He said again he wasn't perfect, but he'd never killed anyone and I ain't no murderer. The next day, September 13th, 2022, they went to see Brian Bennett's mother, Marie. She had already given DNA in 2021 when she had learned that they were investigating one of her sons for sexual assault. Detective Franklin had already made contact with Marie on the phone and told her they believed Brian had committed a sexual assault in Prescott in 1990. C. Bennett, her other son, had also called her and told her they had come with a warrant for his DNA. Now they told her it was actually 2 cases, the sexual assault and a 1987 murder. Marie said, "My son was 16 years old in 1987. This from the report, quote, "At the news that there were 2 cases, Marie appeared to be upset, voice inflection and shaking, and asked if we were aware that her son was deceased. We told Marie that we were aware of that. Marie told us she was very sorry for the other family, and she knew the other family wanted closure on the situations. And then Marie asked, 'So there's 2 crimes,' and we confirmed there were 2 crimes," end quote. Marie then gave the investigators a lot of biological information about her son Brian and their family life. From Sergeant Owens' report, quote, "I asked if when they were in Prescott they did some hiking because Prescott is a big hiking area. Marie told me, no, they were not hikers, they did not hike. Note, when Marie answered the hiking question, her voice changed. She answered the question very emphatically and to the point, as opposed to the other questions asked," end quote. Then Sergeant Owens had to ask Marie for permission to open her son's grave to obtain a sample of his DNA. She became very upset and started crying, saying he'd been buried since 1994. They explained that they would treat his remains with the utmost respect. Marie was concerned that they would take her son's entire body, and the sergeant patiently explained that they would not. They just needed a bone sample, and that he would be reburied as if nothing had happened. From the report, quote, "Marie told me she understood I was just doing my job and how she wanted closure for this as well. Marie told me that her concern was that her boys', meaning C. Bennett and Brian Bennett's, DNA was very similar and what would happen if there was a mistake. I explained to Marie what we do when we take someone's DNA and how there are steps taken from the time we take DNA until after it's analyzed so that mistakes are not made. Marie again was concerned about a mistake being made because she did not know if her son would have done the things we were investigating. Marie said she has prayed he was not involved, but she knew her son went through some hard times. I told Marie that I would help protect C. Bennett by making sure we had the right person who did these crimes. But if C. Bennett did another crime in his past, I could not protect him in that way. But I could only protect him in the way of making sure I had the right person. Marie exclaimed, C. Bennett would never, I know for a fact he would never do anything like this. Note, Marie stated C. Bennett but left out Brian from this statement. Marie further spoke to me about how C. Bennett was married, his job, and how he has led a good life. End quote. On condition that the officers promised not to dig up her entire son and take him away, Marie agreed to the exhumation. The exhumation process was not straightforward. The Arizona authorities had to obtain a warrant from the Kentucky Attorney General's office after the McLean County, Kentucky DA's office refused to authorize the exhumation. Apparently, they didn't want these out-of-staters to come in and dig up their guy. But too bad, it happened anyway. Detective Franklin, Lieutenant Dannison, and Deputy Yavapai County Attorney Casey Harris attended the exhumation at Oak Hill Cemetery in Livermore, Kentucky, on November 18, 2022. This from the report. On November 18, 2022, with the assistance of the Kentucky Attorney General's Office, the Kentucky State Police, and forensic anthropologists from the University of Tennessee, Brian Bennett was exhumed. Samples of his remains were collected based on lab recommendations. After securing the samples of Bennett, the coffin was closed and he was reburied. The collected samples were shipped via FedEx from Kentucky to the Yavapai County Evidence Facility, where they were booked into evidence. Upon return to Prescott, the samples were divided and shipped to the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Lab and to Marshall University for DNA analysis. Continuing from Detective Franklin's report, quote, on March 6, 2023, I received a report from the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Lab. The results of this report contained information related to the DNA extraction of Brian Bennett's DNA and the comparison of this DNA profile to the DNA profile obtained from the SANE kit, this is the rape kit, during the initial investigation. Results of the comparison indicated that Brian Bennett was 290 septillion more times likely to be the contributor of the DNA obtained from the sexual assault kit than any other random individual. Case closed. Suspect deceased. End quote. Well, you heard it. It was a match. Brian Bennett was the man who had sexually assaulted Sarah on the Thumb Butte Trail in 1990. Detective Franklin called Sarah and told her the news and gave her some details on who the man who sexually assaulted her was. So now they had 100% proof positive that Brian Bennett was Sarah's attacker. But what about Cathy? They knew that the Sarah sample had compared favorably to the rock, underwear, oral swab, and ratchet samples in Cathy's case several years earlier. But they wanted to conduct a direct comparison now of Brian Bennett's DNA and the DNA on Cathy's items. In 2023, they reran all the evidence. Private lab independent forensic services recovered autosomal DNA from the ratchet wrench used to bludgeon Cathy. It revealed DNA profiles from multiple contributors. Cathy at 15 of 16 loci, Brian Bennett at 15 of 16 loci, and Robert Blackett at 14 of 16 loci. Blackett was the Arizona DPS lab technician way back in 1987 who had handled the ratchet without the benefit of knowing about DNA contamination. Well, that settled it. Brian Bennett had touched the wrench that had made contact with Cathy Sposito's head. It wasn't definitive enough to convict him in a court of law, but under the totality of the evidence, it was enough that a YCSO report dated August 17, 2023, states that the identification of Brian Bennett as Sarah's assailant also effectively closed the Cathy Sposito cold case. It reads, quote, Bennett's DNA was compared to the DNA in Cathy's case, and he is the likely contributor and likely suspect. Cathy's case can be removed from the cold case files as solved. End quote. Okay, so who was this Brian Bennett? Brian Scott Bennett was born in Calhoun, Kentucky on July 30th, 1970, to mother Marie and father David Bennett. His dad, David, had two brothers, Brian's uncles, but neither of them lived in Arizona, which helped the genealogist hone in on David's branch. Despite his first name being Brian, the family called him Scott. His brother, C, was 2 years younger. Brian had what seems to be a normal family life. His parents had been married for 48 years when his father David died in 2018. David was a diesel mechanic, an Army veteran, and NRA member, and the family attended Baptist church. They moved from Calvin, Kentucky to Prescott when Brian was in high school. He enrolled at Prescott High School on October 13, 1986, as a sophomore. Marie told the investigators that Brian was a, quote, very gentle, loving son. He was quiet and not outgoing. He stayed home reading books, wasn't a troublemaker. His mother said he was a loner and never brought friends to the house. His brother was the popular, gregarious one. She knew Brian had gotten into some trouble, but he mostly got out of it, she said. Brian met his girlfriend Patricia at Prescott High School, and they started dating very seriously. Because Brian never had any close friends, Patricia became, quote, his life. But Brian stopped going to class and pretended he was still going to school. They found out he was just sitting out by the football field. While he had played baseball and basketball when he was younger, he didn't do any sports or activities in high school. He ended up dropping out of Prescott High, officially withdrawing on January 4th, 1988. He worked at K. Bob's restaurant in Prescott from March to May 88 and at OxyCal Vitamin Co. from May to July 88. It doesn't seem like he could hold down a job for very long. Then Patricia got pregnant in the summer of 1988. Brian was still struggling to figure himself out. He worked at Peter Piper Pizza in Prescott from November to December, and then he enlisted in the Army on December 7th, 1988. According to Marie, it was his dream to be in the military like his dad. While he was enlisted, he lived in North Carolina, and he and Patricia married and had their daughter, A.N., who was born on February 28, 1989. Then, when Brian was stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky, Patricia left him, took A.N., and returned to California. Marie told the investigators that after Patricia left Brian, his life changed. He went AWOL on November 2, 1989. His life spiraled downward, and he died from suicide on January 27, 1994, in Island, Kentucky. At that point, he had not seen his daughter, A.N., in 2 years. Okay, now for Brian Bennett's other crimes. He attacked and killed Cathy Sposito on the Thumb Butte Trail on June 13, 1987, when he was a 16-year-old junior at Prescott High School. Then he was married to Patricia and spent some time in the Army, but bailed and returned to Prescott in early 1990. He attacked Sarah on the Thumb Butte Trail on March 22nd of that year. 1990 was a busy year for him. Police know that he forged some checks on May 15th and May 24th. Then, 2 months later, on July 7th, 1990, he was accused by a woman whose initials are VB, referred to as victim number 3, of attempted assault at a house party in Chino Valley. VB was drinking, felt sick, went into a bedroom and lay down. Brian followed her in, locked the door, and tried to sexually assault her. She said later that she thought he was going to kill her. People broke down the door and Brian ran out. He was reported and arrested, but was released on bond. He was indicted for the attempted sexual assault of VB on August 2, 1990. That case went to trial, but Brian was acquitted in November 1990 for supposed discrepancies in witness testimony. Quote from a police report. During a follow-up interview with YCSO cold case investigators on July 6, 2023, victim VB stated she was certain Brian Bennett was her attacker. Meanwhile, just 2 days after that attack, on July 9, 1990, Brian was arrested for that check forgery by the Prescott police. He was convicted of forgery in January 1991, but received minimal prison time. He was released on 3 years probation. Then he perpetrated another attack in 1993. In June 1993, young mother of 2, Renee Sandoval, was approached at a Prescott post office and kidnapped at knife point in her own car. She was driven into the woods and sexually assaulted multiple times, and then was driven around before a police officer pulled over the car for failure to dim the headlights. Renee was able to escape, and Brian was arrested for this incident. But factual discrepancies are cited as the reason he was never prosecuted for this horrific crime. I'm sorry to say that the Prescott PD, or the county prosecutor, some authority, made Renee take a polygraph and judged her results as poor, so the case was dismissed. I like to think that this kind of treatment of a survivor would never happen now. Renee believed her attacker was going to kill her. He told her straight up that he could not let her go because she had seen his face. He had learned from the Chino Valley attack that if the victim identified him, it meant trouble. Meanwhile, after his attack on Renee, Brian Bennett absconded from his Arizona probation related to the 1990 forgery charge. He became a fugitive, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. He returned to Kentucky, where he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head in January 1994. He did not leave a note. Modern investigators noted with great interest that the weapon Brian Bennett shot himself with was a .22. The gun was long gone, and all police records relating to the suicide were destroyed long ago, so it remains unknown whether this perhaps was the same gun Bennett used on Cathy Sposito. And the investigators tried really hard to find out. This part blew my mind a little bit. When they dug Brian Scott Bennett's body up in the exhumation, they were able to pluck the bullet he had shot himself with out of his head. It was still there, rattling around inside his skull. They could not compare it to the bullet in Cathy's case, which was mangled and not suitable for comparison. But comparison to the casing found near Cathy's body confirmed that it was a .22 caliber long rifle bullet consistent with the found casing. Coincidence? I think not. From Detective Franklin's report, on the afternoon of July 27, 2023, I spoke with Renee Sandoval. She recalled being a victim of a case in 1993 and immediately recalled the name Brian Scott. She couldn't recall the last name. I confirmed with her it was Bennett. I advised her I was contacting her because of the closure of the 1990 case and the pending closure of another major case from that time period that may involve the same suspect, end quote. This was, of course, Cathy's case. Detective Franklin told Renee that her attacker had taken his own life in 1994. I can only imagine she felt massive relief at hearing this news. I feel the same way. As Yavapai County Sheriff David Rhodes said, quote, "The fact that he died by suicide was not a bad thing because we spared 3 decades of additional victims." A press conference was held on August 25, 2023, announcing the closure of the Cathy Sposito and Sarah cases. Yavapai County Sheriff Rhodes said he worked the case himself in his early days as a deputy in the 1990s. He questioned how could such an incredibly awful and atrocious thing happen in such a wonderful place. News of the murder rocked the community, he said. Now Lieutenant Pritchard discussed how he took on the case in 2016 as a detective and how he and the volunteer cold case investigators were pretty convinced that Cathy's and Sarah's cases were related. Speaking of the cold case investigators, Rich Finston spoke about the work he and the other volunteers had done. He became quite emotional. Finston worked as a military investigator with the Army and as an engineer and scientist before signing on to the cold case unit. Cathy's case was the first he was assigned 12 years earlier. He told me 61 individual pieces of evidence had been submitted in Cathy's case for DNA analysis over the years, using 8 different labs in 8 different states. Finally, they compared the offender DNA in Cathy's and Sarah's cases and proved they were looking at the same person. Sheriff Rhodes explained that after Brian Bennett was identified as Sarah's attacker, they returned to the ratchet wrench. The DNA mixture on the wrench was the reason they had been unable to solve the case. The wrench was touched by several people, including Elizabeth R., who handed it to a deputy at the scene, and the lab tech, who commingled his own DNA. Knowing that Brian Bennett had been conclusively linked to Sarah's case, they went back and reanalyzed the mixture on the ratchet wrench using modern techniques, and that's when they determined that the number 1 contributor was Cathy and the number 2 was Brian Bennett. Sheriff Rhodes made sure to emphasize that because of the commingled samples from multiple contributors, Brian Scott Bennett cannot be declared 100% Cathy's killer. But with the strength of the Brian Bennett DNA profile on the wrench, plus the circumstantial evidence of the exact same MO and location and time of day, the sheriff said, quote, "I am saying today with high confidence that Cathy Sposito was murdered by Brian Scott Bennett," end quote. He gave thanks to the work of his cold case team, saying 4 women were given either closure, peace, or validation today. Speaking of the 4 women, Renee Sandoval was emotional when she addressed the media at the press conference. She said, "This is a long time coming." She asked people to pray for those people who have suffered a crime like this. She told people to remain vigilant and aware of their surroundings at all times. She said of Cathy Sposito, quote, "We are always going to be tied together. We are always going to have a connection. She will be with me till the day I die. Cathy, you're free." Sandoval said she'd been on the Thumb Butte Trail herself and said she was overcome with emotion when she got the call that her attacker had been linked to a murder of a young woman there. She told the Arizona Republic she and Cathy's family and the other survivors were all supporting each other and felt connected, even though they didn't really know each other. She had gotten to know Cathy through becoming close with Cathy's brother, Sal. Prescott Mayor Phil Good said in a statement, Quote, advancements in DNA allow for closure for everyone involved in cold cases such as Cathy Sposito. With such information available nowadays, there's a good chance you get a knock on the door that justice has been served. Okay, just to tie up a few loose ends here. Officials do not believe that Brian Bennett and Cathy knew one another. His MO was to attack strangers. The reason he was never linked to her case or Sarah's is because he was never convicted of any crime like this. The YCSO was never tipped about him, and since he died in 1994, his DNA was not in CODIS. It is now, though, and we'll see whether anything comes of that. Cathy Sposito is believed to have been 16-year-old Brian Bennett's first victim, but Sheriff Rhodes thinks it's likely he has more. He said, quote, what we know of serious violent predators like this is that it is very unlikely, given the frequency in which he was willing to act, that these are the only 4 cases that exist, end quote. The sheriff speculated that perhaps Brian Bennett killed Cathy because she was loud and put up a fight. Sarah was quiet and compliant when he threatened her with the rock, and Renee was told he couldn't let her go because she'd seen his face. He only stopped because he was interrupted. Whether murders or sexual assaults, Brian Bennett could have perpetrated these offenses against many more women in the locations he was known to be in: North Carolina, Kansas, California, Kentucky, Arizona. Yavapai County officials request that anyone with any more information on Brian Scott Bennett please contact them. After 36 years, Cathy Sposito's case is closed thanks to forensic genealogy, and victim number 2's case, instrumental in solving Cathy's case, is closed as well after 33 years. And if you're one of the bad guys, they're coming for you. Thank you so much to Stephanie Wyatt, Rich Finston, and Lieutenant Dan Pritchard for speaking with me about this case. Hey, DNA ID listeners, it's Jess with an exciting announcement. Some of you might have noticed that this week's episode of DNA ID is the show's 100th episode. I'm so happy the show has grown as much as it has in the past 3 years I've been doing it. But we'd love to see it get even more listeners. It would be really helpful if you all recommended the show to a friend or posted about it on a podcast review site or group that you participate in. But what really helps is 5-star reviews, especially on Apple Podcasts. The more of those the show gets, the more Apple's all-important algorithm features the show, which really helps it grow. To that end, I'm incentivizing listeners to leave 5-star reviews by giving out prizes. Here's how it's going to work. Go to the show on Apple Podcasts and submit a 5-star review. You don't have to write anything. Just click on the 5 stars. Then screenshot your 5 stars and send an email with the screenshot and your name and address to the show at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. That's dnaidpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. I'll give you plenty of time to do this, don't worry. And if you don't use Apple Podcasts, submit a glowing review using the rating system of whatever your favorite podcast platform is and send it to us. At the end of the episode on May 6th, I'll draw the names of 3 listeners who submitted their 5-star review screen grabs as long as they provided their name and address. And they'll receive some DNA swag and a thank you note from me. And I'll read the names of all 3 winners on the show. Everyone loves to win free stuff, and you can qualify just by supporting the show. Thank you all for being such loyal and dedicated listeners over the last 3 1/4 seasons. 100 episodes is a real milestone, but there are many more to come. Thank you. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to dnaidpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, And you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.